Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here, and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video, we have my Game Week 5 deadline decisions. This is a weekly series where I take you through your final thoughts, questions, and dilemmas ahead of the upcoming deadline. If you are enjoying the content here on this channel, or maybe if you're new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. We are trying to hit 100,000 subscribers before the end of September, but without further ado, let's jump into it. There were quite a lot of questions around Newcastle players because this is the start of their slightly better fixture run. Obviously, the first 4 game weeks were very, very tough for Newcastle, but they've got Brentford this week. And then after this week, the fixtures do look very, very nice. So lots of questions around, should you bring in Newcastle assets? And the easy answer to that is definitely yes. I think they're an excellent team. We'd probably expect them to comfortably challenge for the top 4 once again. Whether they get that or not will probably depend on the teams around them. But I also wanted to just discuss their schedule, because I don't think it's as easy as just saying, yes, definitely bring in the likes of Isak, Trippier, because they are in Europe. And they've also got a very tricky domestic cup game coming up. So the next few fixtures, as you can see on the left-hand side of the graphic, they've got Brentford this week, then Sheffield United, then Burnley. Look like great fixtures on paper, especially as the trickiest fixture is against Brentford, and that is, of course, at home. So you really like the look of those. But in between each of those fixtures, they've got a very, very difficult cup game. So in between the first 2 fixtures, they have AC Milan, then they've got Man City, and then they have PSG. So it is by no means an easy fixture run. And you have to think that there will be rotation for Newcastle. Now, do I think that it's maybe being blown slightly out of proportion with some of the players? Absolutely. I think this doesn't necessarily mean that all of the Newcastle assets will be rotated very, very heavily, but you do have to expect more rotation than what we saw last season. One player that a lot of people are looking at, and I myself am looking at as well, is Kieran Trippier. And I do think there is a small chance that Kieran Trippier misses one of the upcoming easier Premier League games. He is getting older every year, and I know that's a very obvious point. Everyone gets older every year. But he is getting to an age now where he just won't be able to play 2 or 3 times a week for the entire season and avoid injuries, or it's very, very unlikely that he will. So I'm looking at this and thinking, if you are going to rest Kieran Trippier in one of these fixtures, it's very unlikely to be Milan, City, or PSG. He probably doesn't need a rest against Brentford. I'm looking at maybe that Newcastle or that Burnley fixture and thinking, if Trippier was benched, would I be surprised? No. The other reason, as well as the difficult schedule, is they have brought in Livramento, and people are saying one of the main reasons that Livramento was brought in, and it is a bit of hypothesizing, is to give Trippier the opportunity to be rested and rotated. All of that to say, I think if you're looking much longer term, if you're not just looking at the next 3 or 4 fixtures for Newcastle, I think it's worth bringing Trippier in. I don't think he's going to be rotated enough to justify not bringing him in when we know how good Newcastle are defensively and we know how attacking Trippier is. However, if you're someone like me that's maybe thinking about wildcarding in game week 8, 9 or 10, you do need to look a little bit shorter term. And if Trippier misses one of the fixtures coming up, especially in a week where your bench isn't great, or if he comes off the bench, then it's probably not ideal. So I still think Trippier's a good option. I wouldn't let this put me off. All I would say is don't be surprised if he does miss out, and maybe just make sure that you do think about your bench order just in case he doesn't come on at all. I would say Isak and Wilson, it's a lot trickier. It would put me off both of them for the reason that I've just listed. We don't know whether Isak or Wilson will be preferred in the Prem, and then which one will be preferred in the Cup. We don't know if they'll be played together. We don't know if they'll be coming off around 55, 60 minutes and the other one coming on. I still think that Isak is first choice, but Callum Wilson could start the Premier League games, and it could be that Isak is preferred in the Cup and also in the Champions League too. So Isak and Wilson, it would put me off. I would say that if Botman's fit, he's probably the safest option at a very cheap price, as is Fabian Schär, who has some pretty decent attacking threat in the last 2 seasons as well. So maybe if you don't want to risk it with Trippier, whilst they could also technically be rested and rotated, I think it's much less likely that Fabian Schär and Botman are rotated, just due to the position that they play and also their age as well. So I think you're less likely to get rotation with those 2. I would love to know down below what you're thinking about the Newcastle assets. I think they are great options, and if you want to take the risk, go for it. I wouldn't be put off of Trippier. I would just keep it in the back of your mind. I still think he's a great option. I would still be looking to invest in at least one Newcastle defender for their upcoming run, but probably Pope in goal if you can get a goalkeeper, or Botman or Schär would be a slightly safer player to bring in with the upcoming schedule. So lots of people asking about wildcards this week, and we're actually going to take a look at a wildcard draft for Game Week 5 in a second. But lots of people also asking, what is the best time to wildcard? Maybe I am considering it in Game Week 5, or I'm looking at my team and I don't need it. When should I be looking to wildcard? Obviously, the caveat is that it's team dependent, and that is a bit of a cliche saying, but it is, because everyone's team is different and everyone's strategy is different as well. So this is based on sort of my team or the rough template, and also just based on, let's say we ignore team, which we shouldn't, which weeks look like there are some fixture swings or some potential opportunities to wildcard. So I would say that the third best option, in my opinion, if we're just ignoring Game Week 5 for now, is Game Week 8. I think it looks like there are a few fixture swings starting in Game Week 8. Specifically, Spurs and Villa's fixtures look really, really good from Game Week 8. And the likes of Arsenal have a couple of tricky fixtures in a row. You might want to offload. So you might want to do like Saka to Maddison and Son. You might want to bring in the likes of Diaby and Watkins. Also, Liverpool's fixture run does start around then too. So Game Week 8 looks like the start of the big fixture swings. And maybe you can get ahead of the curve. A lot of other people will be looking to wildcard in Game Week 9 or 10. Maybe you can just get ahead of the curve by 1 week. The only thing that I would say around Game Week 8 is not all of the fixtures start in Game Week 8. So actually, you can see, for example, Chelsea have a really nice fixture still in Game Week 8, and that is their final good fixture. So I wouldn't say that all of the fixture swings start in Game Week 8, and maybe you are moving 1 week too early. Also, it's the week before an international break, and anything can happen over the international break. You might wildcard into a perfect team, pick up 4 injuries, and all of a sudden you're in a really, really tricky position with your team where you need to take a hit. So I always think that wildcarding before an international break, whilst it can work, doesn't always feel like the best option. So whilst I do like Game Week 8, I think it's probably only the 3rd best option for me. I would say that the best option, and the one that I'm most likely to do, is Game Week 9 to 10. The reason for that is pretty much all of the fixture swings happen around then. Obviously, you have a couple in Game Week 8, but remember, if you wildcard in 9 or 10, you've got free transfers to use in Game Week 8. So I can still bring in Maddison and Son for the fixtures in Game Week 8 and Game Week 9 if I decide to wildcard in Game Week 10. And then in Game Week 10, we've got Liverpool, Villa, West Ham, all of their fixtures start to improve, and the likes of Chelsea and Man City go on pretty tricky fixture runs. So if you've got like Sterling, Chilwell, Jackson, Foden, and you don't have any of like Diaby, Watkins, Salah, it feels like a really good opportunity to switch around a lot of your players. I've looked at a wildcard, and I'm making at least 9 or 10 changes to my 15 players. So for me, it looks like the most obvious point to wildcard. The only thing is, you might not need it. So let's say you already have Maddison and Son. Let's say by Game Week 19, you'll already have those. Let's say you don't have Jackson, you never went for him, and you've got Ollie Watkins still, and you only own Chilwell and you didn't go for Sterling. You might be looking at your team in Game Week 9-10 and saying, actually, I'm in a really good position. Maybe you're still holding like Mohamed Salah. Then you probably don't need to wildcard. So whilst I don't think there is an obvious weak point for wildcarding Game Week 9 to 10, it is team dependent, and if your team's set up in a certain way, you might not necessarily need it. And then, in my opinion, the second best time to wildcard is basically as late as possible around Game Week 8, Game Week 18, Game Week 19. The reason for that is there is a blank for Man City and Brentford in Game Week 18, which means that you can dead end into 18, remove, what you mean by dead is basically remove all of your Man City and Brentford assets going into Game Week 18, basically just use that as one final week, remove those assets. You could even remove Haaland for a week, and then you wildcard in Game Week 19 and bring those assets back into your team. So it allows you to deal with that blank game week for Man City and Brentford and then bring those assets back in, because Brentford actually have a really nice fixture run from Game Week 19 onwards. So I don't think you would just want to remove those assets long term, especially if you've got like an Mbeumo and a Flecken, you probably want to keep them. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking that could be nice to deal with that blank game week. And also it's as late as possible. And the later that you play your wildcard, it makes it a lot easier for your second wildcard. Because remember, from Game Week 20 onwards, you get a second wildcard. But if you've already wildcarded in Game Week 3 or 4, by the time Game Week 20 comes around, you might well need your second wildcard. Whereas if you wildcard really late, you're less likely to need that second wildcard until later in the season. So I feel like it sets you up really well for the back end of the season. The only thing is with a late wildcard is you could be very, very far behind by the time that Game Week 19 swings around. Let's say you don't wildcard in Game Week 9 and 10, and I do, and I absolutely nail it. You could be really far behind by the time you eventually get your wildcard. And whilst I said it does look good on paper now, it may be that by the time you get to Game Week 18-19, let's say that Mbeumo's injured, you don't own Flecken, maybe Haaland gets injured in like Game Week 13 anyway, and by the time you get to Game Week 18 or Game Week 19, you're looking at your team and saying, I don't really need a wildcard here, but I've got to use one for the sake of it, and I've missed out on all of those points earlier on in the season. So it is always very risky holding a wildcard as late as possible, especially when other people are deploying it quite early. So that's my opinion on it. I think Game Week 9 or Game Week 10 will be the best week, depending on what your team looks like. Because some people's teams look really well set up for Game Week 9 already. So it may be Game Week 10 that you choose to play it. But I think that's the best. I don't mind going a bit early in Game Week 8. I also don't mind holding it until Game Week 18, Game Week 19. That being said, Game Week 5 could work. So a lot of people are looking to play it this week. You get Son, Maddison in for their really nice fixture in Game Week 5. You can offload some of the players that you're not necessarily trusting at the moment. Maybe some of the Manchester United and Arsenal midfielders. I don't dislike it. I just think that these three are slightly better. But just in case you are looking to wildcard this week, let's take a look at a wildcard draft. So I'm not going to talk about this in too much detail, because obviously if I were on a wildcard, I would have thought about this in even more detail than I have when I put this draft together. And I think you really do need to think longer term than you realise when you're playing an early wildcard such as a Game Week 5 wildcard. Because remember, you can't deal with the fixture swings in Game Week 8, 9 and 10 with a wildcard now because you've used your wildcard. So you have to think about not only Game Week 5 to Game Week 7 or 8, but also those big fixture swings in 9 and 10. So that is the first thing. And you also need to think about, like I said, that blank in Game Week 18 and future game weeks beyond Game Week 10 too. So whilst I'm not saying you necessarily need to plan out Game Week 14, 15, 16, etc., because you'll have free transfers, you do need to think beyond the immediate future especially when you're deploying an early wildcard. And what I've tried to do here is I've tried to think a little bit about those fixture swings in Game Week 9 and Game Week 10, but it's still not perfect. There's still an absence of Liverpool here. The reason for that is I'm still not convinced that Salah is worth it. And on top of that, I'm still not sure out of the likes of Darwin, Gakpo, Jota, Diaz, Trent, are any of those going to be worth it too? But there is a fixture swing for Liverpool, and I think we're going to want to own it. I'm just not sure at the moment who. So I've tried to get the price points in place so that when you're ready to make that move, you have the opportunity to bring those players in. But let's go through the team really briefly. I've got 2 Aston Villa players because, again, from Game Week 8 onwards, Villa's fixtures are really nice. That is Emi Martinez and Diaby. You could put Watkins in there as well, but I feel like you can maybe wait and bring in the 3rd Aston Villa asset around Game Week 8, Game Week 9. And I just think Diaby looks so good at that price point, and I think that there aren't many good goalkeepers at the moment, and I don't mind Emi Martinez as a choice there. So 2 Villa. I've also got a double Newcastle defence, Trippier and Botman. I think if I was on a wild card, I'd definitely have Trippier. Again, you've got the risk that we spoke about at the start of the video, and Botman, assuming he's fit, I think is worth the saving over a Fabian Schär. And when you need to, I would be perfectly happy playing double Newcastle defence. I've still got Chilwell and Udogie. Chilwell in particular, you could definitely drop from this team. I know they've got obviously a negative fixture swing coming up soon, and lots of people aren't convinced by Chelsea. I just think that Chilwell is still good enough to pick. The fixtures are still good for the next few, and he's still playing in a very attacking role. Udogie feels like an obvious choice, but just be willing to bench him in Game Week 6 and 7. For me, Botman comes in 6 and 7 to replace Udogie. The midfield 5, I've still got Fernandes and I've removed Saka. You could by all means have Saka in there instead of Fernandes. I think Manchester United's fixtures are pretty good, and I want one of Fernandes or Rashford. For the time being, I still think Fernandes is a slightly better option. And I've actually put Gabriel Jesus in there because I've removed Saka. So you still have an Arsenal attacker in there for the next 3 fixtures, which aren't too bad, but you're not loaded up on Arsenal. Again, around Game Week 8, Game Week 9, Arsenal's fixtures turn for the worst, and I don't think you necessarily want to be loaded up on Arsenal attackers. I've got Mbeumo in there, of course, then I've got Son and Maddison as a double up on the Spurs attack. So I think this is a really good team. And you've got Morris and Kabore in there as well, and I know that Kabore isn't 100% nailed, but you do then have 2 Luton players for double Game Week 7. You might be in a slightly trickier position here because the bench isn't great. If Botman is out longer term and Kabore is a little, obviously doesn't start, then you might come into a little bit of an issue. But I feel like it is deep enough, and I feel like the squad is good enough. You actually have a bit of a benching headache after Game Week 7 if you have Morris in there. But you could, of course, do Morris down to Archer at some point, or you could just start with Archer if you want to. And then I've got Areola as opposed to Turner, just because Areola looks like his first choice, and Turner could be losing his place. So hopefully that is clear there. I think it's a pretty good wildcard draft. It might not be exactly what I went with. Again, if I thought about this in tons more detail, I would love to know down below if you're wildcarding. How far off of your team is this? I'm just trying to think a little bit beyond the next few, and also think about some of those fixture swings coming up. So there were quite a few questions around, is this a time to captain against Haaland? And I kind of get these questions every week, and generally I just don't talk about it in the videos because I am very pro-captain Haaland. I think there are better places to take risks in FPL than backing against one of the best players we've seen in Premier League history, with some of the best days that we've seen, in one of the best teams that we've ever seen too. I just think in most weeks it just doesn't make sense. And especially at the start of the season with the fixtures that City have had, it just doesn't make sense to me to back against Erling Haaland. That being said, I thought I would provide an alternative discussion in this video around captaining against Haaland. So there is a guy over on Twitter called Alex. He's absolutely brilliant to follow for Man City stuff, does a lot of threads too. So you can see his handle on the screen. Feel free to go and follow him. At the start of the season, he did a very good sort of stats deep dive around the theory that Haaland isn't great away from home. There is a lot of people that say Haaland's better at home, he's not great away. And he did a deep dive, and I'm not going to go through all of the stats here because it would take a while, but the conclusion based on the data was this formula from Alex. Any game week where City play at home, you captain Haaland. Because again, the data did support the fact that Haaland is much better at home, and City are better at home as well. They tend to score more goals. Any game week where City are away playing against a bottom 6 defence, you still captain Haaland. Because again, it doesn't tend to matter if they're away or at home. If they're playing a weak defence, they still score goals, and so does Haaland. So that kind of backs up what you would expect. City at home, captain Haaland, doesn't matter who they're playing. And then City away against weaker defences, you would still captain Haaland. The data suggested, though, unless it's kind of a bottom 6 defence and they're playing against a slightly stronger defence, away, City aren't as sort of gun-ho with their attacking. And also, Haaland tends to struggle a little bit more. His data is nowhere near as good. And especially when you start to look at those really strong defences away from home, Haaland tends to really struggle. So this would suggest, as you can see in the bottom tweet, which Alex did today in a thread, maybe this is a week to back against Haaland because City are away from home. West Ham are certainly not a bottom 6 defence, and they've actually started the season relatively well. West Ham aren't prone to conceding a massive number of goals, and City don't, as we said, they don't tend to really go out there and try and destroy good defences away from home, or at least they aren't able to. So this does feel like a game week where you probably are expecting Haaland to score, as you are in most weeks, but you're not necessarily expecting 2, 3, 4 attacking returns from Haaland. Whereas you are potentially thinking that Heung-min Son or Maddison against Sheffield United at home could achieve that, especially under Postecoglou. So I just thought I'd provide an alternative idea here that maybe these are the kind of weeks where you can back against Haaland. My alternative response to that would be Haaland still has exceptional data. City will still score goals against West Ham, you would expect. And even if City only win this game 2-0, I would not be surprised if that's a Haaland brace. So whilst, again, I am not expecting City to go out there and beat West Ham by 6-7 goals, I still don't think that makes Haaland a terrible captaincy shout. So even if I had Son, I would still captain Haaland because I think, as I said, there are better times and ways to back against the crowd. There are better ways to take risks. Take your risk with a transfer, bring in a differential transfer. I just think backing against Haaland on any given week is such a risk that it can absolutely derail your season. And for me, I wouldn't be doing it. But I just thought I'd present this and just say, if you want to go for it, these are the kind of weeks where I would be tempted, especially when you have an alternative captaincy option with a much better home fixture. Let me know down below if you are considering going against Haaland. Only last week we were discussing why Chelsea assets are such great options, and then this week there are so many questions around selling Sterling, selling Jackson, and also Chilwell, but we're going to focus specifically on Sterling and Jackson here. One of the questions was, I really want Heung-min Son, rightly so, looks like a fantastic option, and I don't want to sell any of my other midfielders. Maybe you don't want to sell the likes of Bruno, Rashford, Saka, and Burmo. Is selling Sterling viable? And then some people are asking about selling Jackson because they just don't think he's a great finisher. They don't think he will convert the chances that he gets. I will start with Jackson. This one's a lot easier for me. I don't really think I would consider selling him. The reason for that is he is getting a ridiculous amount of big chances. The most big chances in the league over the opening 4 game weeks. His data is really, really good. And I know players like Darwin have had really good data in the past and haven't converted. But generally, across thousands of footballers, if players get that many opportunities, they tend to score goals. And I would expect sooner rather than later that Jackson will start to finish some of those chances, despite missing a lot of them in the opening 4 game weeks. On top of that, there just aren't many viable alternatives. If there were like a list of like 7 or 8 really good attackers that I desperately wanted, then yes, I would be tempted. And I know the likes of Alvarez is great, and Watkins has good fixtures coming up, and Morris has a double game week, but none of them strike me as much better options than Jackson. So for me, based on the data that I can see and the lack of viable alternatives and the fixtures coming up for Chelsea, Jackson's not an option to sell. Sterling, I understand more. The reason I understand Sterling more is because it's not necessarily that I think Sterling's an issue. It's that Heung-min Son is such a brilliant option. So is Maddison. And there are some other really good midfielders that we want to keep. The likes of Bruno, Rashford, Saka, and Burmo, who are my other 4 midfielders, are all such great options that, yeah, maybe you do look at Sterling and say he's the one that has to make way. And on top of that, his data still hasn't been good this season. We took a bit of a risk in game week 4, bringing in Sterling on the back of his 19-pointer, despite the data not being great. And maybe it was a bit of a mistake. Maybe it was just the Luton effect. Maybe it was just one good game. So I understand if you want to sell him. I would just say that probably nothing's changed. When you brought in Sterling last week, you brought him in because you thought he was a good option and the fixtures coming up for Chelsea are really good. I don't think anything's changed. I think he will still get chances to score goals and get assists, and also the fixtures are still good. And last week, Sterling almost set Jackson up for an assist. Maybe unlucky not to come away with any points. So I still feel like Sterling is fine. I wouldn't force the transfer, but if you've got 2 free transfers, you don't want to sell any of your other midfielders, and you really want Heung-min Son, I can understand why you want Sterling to make way. I don't really understand the Jackson move personally. I'll be keeping both Sterling and Jackson. I'll give my Chelsea assets at least 1 more week. If it's another poor performance from both of them, next week we'll discuss in a little bit more detail selling them, because I think at that stage, you've given them maybe enough of the good fixtures and they're not necessarily performing. So we did discuss this in the Game Week 5 preview in a little bit of detail around goalkeeper transfers and whether I think they're worth making. So go back and watch that if you haven't. But specifically, there were some questions around Turner and Johnstone. If you own both Turner and Johnstone, what do you do? Because they both look like they could be losing their position in the starting 11 very, very soon. So worry or wait. Do you transfer them out now, or do you wait until they lose their place? And then some people will say, like, they've got 2 free transfers. Is it more of a priority to sort out the goalkeeper situation? Or would you be more aggressive, make an outfield position sort of change, and then just wait and see what happens with the goalkeepers? And I would say, obviously, I don't know what's going to happen with both of these, but unless we get really negative news in the press conferences, which I haven't seen at this stage at time of me recording this, I would probably just wait, and I wouldn't make a transfer yet. The reason I say that is Johnstone has been really, really good, but Turner in particular has been absolutely excellent. Turner was brought in this season for Nottingham Forest and hasn't really put a foot wrong. I don't see I don't feel like it would be a brilliant sort of psychological decision and a great team morale decision to just drop these keepers despite making no mistakes. I mean, we've seen it with Ramsdale and Raya. Ramsdale's been performing well, so he's got that spot for the time being. And I think it could be the case with Turner and Johnstone. At the very least, you would hope that one of them keeps their place. So yeah, maybe Turner does lose his place, but you've still got Johnstone there. So I would say for now, I don't think it's a priority. If you want to make the transfer, fine. Maybe you are looking to bring the likes of Fleck and Pope or Leno, and you just want to make the move this week, then go for it. But if you're asking me, do I think you need to? I would hope that both of them get a couple more games at the very least. And I do think that Turner should, based on his performances, get the game against Burnley, which is the better one on paper. So I'm looking at Pickford and Turner and thinking, obviously, if Turner doesn't play, I get Pickford off the bench against Arsenal, which isn't ideal, but I am banking on the fact that I do expect Turner to get the fixture in Game Week 5 at the very least, and then maybe after that he is dropped. All I would say is pay attention to the press conferences, because I assume these questions could be asked about whether Turner and Johnstone are going to remain first choice, and that may give us a bit more information. But for the time being, I personally wouldn't be too worried. So guys, there you have it. That is my Game Week 5 deadline decisions video. If you haven't seen throughout the week, I do have the flu absolutely terribly, to be honest. It's the worst I've felt for a while. So I apologize if I seem slightly off or if I'm not quite myself in these videos, but I am slowly getting over it. If you did enjoy today's video, please do drop a like on the video. Let's aim for 2,000 likes. And also make sure to subscribe. We are on the road to 100,000 subscribers, and I would love to hit that by the end of September. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.